July 10th, 1996, at a joint session of the United States Congress, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu received a standing ovation for the following words, quote, "With America's help, Israel has grown to be a powerful modern state, but I believe there can be no greater tribute to America's long-standing economic aid to Israel than for us to be able to say, we are going to achieve economic independence. We are going to do it. In the next 4 years, we will begin the long-term process of gradually reducing the level of your generous economic assistance to Israel," end quote. Now, can't the United States Congress even do what the Prime Minister of Israel said would be done in 1996? That's another taboo. There are a lot of people in sub-Saharan Africa, men, women, and children, who need clinics, who need programs against infectious diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis, and who need schools to be built. And that money is much better spent if we're going to keep it in the foreign aid area and among those countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Taboo number 3 is the Iranian situation. This is quite an astonishing inversion of reality. Iran, as you know, elected Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1952, I believe. In 1953, he was overthrown with what is now acknowledged history by the Eisenhower administration and the CIA because he wanted to nationalize the only major resource at that time, natural resource, which is the oil from the Anglo-American oil company, Anglo-Iranian oil company. And that, of course, ushered in the Shah, the dictatorship of the Shah for 27 years with all the attendant brutality. The Iranians do not suffer from amnesia. They know that we helped Saddam Hussein, who was then our anti-communist dictator ally, to invade that country with hundreds of thousands of fatalities on both sides. They know that their country is surrounded by the U.S. military and the Israeli military. They know that there are special forces in Iran now in violation of international law. They know that Israel has over 200 nuclear weapons and does not belong to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Therefore, the UN doesn't have any access to do any inspections. And they know that they've been called the axis of evil, along with Iraq, and they know what happened to Iraq after it was called a member of the axis of evil. Now, I wonder why they're nervous. I wonder why the Iranians are frightened. Wouldn't we be? And so the drumbeat by the neoconservatives and others in this country for more military action involving Iran continues. And the same people are writing the same articles and the same op-eds in the New York Times and Washington Post. The same people are having the conferences. The same people are pushing members of Congress. Congressman Ron Paul, about 3 years ago, put in the Congressional Record a speech on the Iranian situation where he actually started with history. And I commend that speech to your attention. If we don't overcome the taboo of censorship and distortion here, if we don't recognize that about 7 years ago, the Iranian government sent a very deliberative peace proposal to the Bush administration, which was ignored. We're heading for another conflict. And this one, if it's ignited, is going to be much worse and much more horrific than the one in Iraq. Taboo number 4, the misuse of language. The sign of powerlessness by one side to a conflict is that it uses the other side's language. How many of you have heard the word settlers when in fact they're colonists? How many of you have heard the word the right to defend when it's used one side? If Israel has a right to defend itself, don't the Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? After all, the casualty toll for civilians is about 400 to 1. 400 Palestinians died or injured to a ratio of 1. That's the ratio in the Gaza massacre, for example. Nonviolent policies and strategies in my book are always the best, but when there is conflict and when the word terror is thrown around, and terror means attacking innocent civilians, the Israeli government is the champion when it comes to other parties in the Middle East opposed to it. This is the 5th most powerful military force in the world. It's so modern, it teaches our military from time to time about the advances. Language is very important. We have to ask ourselves, why is the phrase kidnapping this unfortunate young Israeli soldier used to capture a soldier, but the kidnapping of a dozen elected members to the Palestinian parliament right after they're elected, and they remain in jail now by the Israelis, is not called a kidnapping? Along with 10,000 other Palestinians in Israeli jails. Language is very important, and if we don't use the right language, if we don't use accurate language, it's hard to make a proper argument and appeal to reason and fact. 5th taboo, the word anti-Semitism. In a forthcoming book by Jim Zogby called Arab Voices, What They Are Saying to Us and Why It Matters, in Chapter 8, and he is working on a lot of polling that his brother's firm has done in the Middle East, so it isn't just suppositions. But in this book, he starts out by saying, in the heyday of the Oslo peace process, and I'm quoting, world-renowned Israeli hairstylist and activist Vidal Sassoon invited me to address a major symposium on anti-Semitism sponsored by Hebrew University. In hopes of opening a dialogue of what I saw as a growing concern, I presented a paper called, quote, Anti-Semitism and the Other Anti-Semitism, end quote, in which I pointed out that historically the prejudices directed against Jews and Arabs have been a linked phenomenon. Now, if you looked at the kind of bigotry and discrimination, and not just in opinion, but in the misuse of law and the legal practice in this country, anti-Semitism against Arabs is far, far greater than anti-Semitism against Jews. And yet, that description is almost never used. There's no monopoly by the Jewish people of the phrase anti-Semitism. All over the world, we see the rise of discrimination and bigotry, and it's been around for centuries as well. And we've got to recover a moral equivalence here in the contemporary sense of that phrase. He goes on to discuss the historical linkage, and when that book comes out, I commend it to you. You remember the Yemeni-American teacher who was to take the helm of a school in New York City, a middle school that would specialize in teaching students Arabic? And she was driven from her job with the most bigoted anti-Semitism against an Arab American in recent months. And she's now in court trying to have the court recognize the damage done to her. But again, if the shoe was on the other foot, you know the words would be used quite prominently. The moral equivalence, again, is a taboo. How many times have you heard that in the Israeli context, but not in the Palestinian context? Is there a moral equivalence between 400 casualties, civilian, to 1? I don't think so. but the phrase is actually applied in reverse, as if the casualty toll is much higher on the Israeli side. I think what we need to talk about more is how do we enlist more people in what's going on against Muslim Americans and Arab Americans in this country. You have people who've spoken to you earlier today, like Attorney Charlie Swift and others, who are very well aware of what is going on that is not being publicized in the media. But what is going on is an unabated misuse of legal process, which will erupt if there is an incident that occurs. It will erupt throughout the country against people of Arab descent, and it will further coarsen the legal process in the way enforcement treats other minorities as well. There's a contagion here. Once the rules are violated, once the barriers are crossed, lots of other people who have funny sounding last names are placed on the defensive. The bottom line, of course, is what David Ben-Gurion said to Nahum Goldman in an often repeated comment in the Israeli press. And that was, he said to Nahum Goldman, "It was their land and we took it." That is the bottom line from which all discussion proceeds. The distinction between the occupier and the occupied. The distinction between the aggressor and the pallid resistance. The distinction between the control of water and land and confiscation of land and deprivation of humanitarian assistance and the necessities of life. Who's doing it and who's on the receiving end? I'm often reminded of the courage of the Israeli soldiers who are in the reserves and who are able to be called up very quickly, as you know, who refused to serve in the West Bank and Gaza. Some of them were jailed and others were ostracized. They were almost between 1,000 and 1,500 strong. And they were not just low-ranking. Some of them were fairly high-ranking reservists who had fought in prior wars. And they put out a statement. And just think of the courage to make this statement. When they declared their refusal, quote, to fight beyond the 1967 borders in order to dominate, expel, starve, and humiliate an entire people, end quote. You want a badge of courage, you give it to those reservists. Have they been heard? Have they been heard in Congress? Have they been given a hearing? No way. Until we rescue Congress from the largest taboo of all, which is the shutdown of our national legislature to entertain all the variables and all the options, and to realize how ready so many people are for a settlement of this many decades-old conflict, there will be no tide turning, no tide whatsoever. I work mostly in the corporate crime, fraud, and abuse area. And I have seen public opinion polls dramatically turn upward against powerful corporations. 75% of the American people think corporations have too much control over their lives. And it hasn't made much difference on Capitol Hill. The collapse of Wall Street and all the crookery and speculation and abuse and depletion of trillions of dollars of pension funds and savings to the American people, and the loss of 8 million jobs, and the legislation, as was pointed out today in the New York Times by